Hey everybody, it's Lear from Lear Gaming, and today I have another build for you for Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. And this build, I call it my Thor Stormcaller Mjolnir, and this is a Clawbringer slash Brr-Zerker build. So I find this build extremely thematic. It is a ranged melee build, meaning you are technically focusing on melee damage, but you are doing it at range, whether it's with your standard melee attack or with your special attack that's going to be kind of your big burst DPS. Now, this build is actually quite tanky. It does a lot of burst DPS, and it also just feels really, really fun. It feels very, very much as I would imagine playing a combination of Thor, maybe a little Loki too, because you got kind of like the ice storm going on, but I really wanted to go with the theme of bringing down lightning, creating like an ice storm lightning effect, and just smashing things as hard as you could with a hammer. Now, the reason I wanted to make sure this was a ranged melee build is because in Chaos 20, especially when you start adding a bunch of curses, being in pure melee is extremely difficult. You're very likely to get one or two shots just because of all the negative effects. So the game really, really pushes you to be attacking from ranged. This allows you to still have a kind of melee build, but at the safety of playing at kind of a mid-range. You can spend some time in melee range, but you do not want to be face tanking in this game at higher difficulties. So in this build video, we're going to go over everything you need to know to get started. We're going to be looking at the skill tree. We're going to be looking at kind of the hero talents, hero ability points that you want to invest into as you level up. We're going to look at the gear, and I'm going to talk to you about the synergies and the playstyle as well. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. As you do, make sure to drop a like. If you want to see more videos like this, do drop a comment. Let me know what kind of builds you'd like to see me put together. And as always, subscribe to be notified when my next videos drop. With that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at my Thor Stormcaller build. All right, let's start by taking a look at your hero points. So as far as archetype, I went with the Village Idiot. I kind of like the Village Idiot as far as it gives you a nice strength boost. Doesn't really have too much negativity. Has a couple points in intelligence, minus intelligence. Everything else is pretty neutral. So it's a nice overall start. Now, as far as where I put my points in personally, I first maxed out attunement. So we want to get that skill cooldown reduction because we want to be spamming our ability as much as possible. Now, I personally then chose to max out intelligence to get our spell cooldown down. So I want to make sure that I can consistently cast spells and interweave them with the action skill. We always want to be able to precede our action skill with a spell because of some of the synergies we're going to have that you're going to see when we go over the build. But it's up to you. You could potentially lean less into the spell elements, and you could instead, for example, pump your crit damage more. And then for me, I personally pumped some Constitution. I want to get my shielding up nice and high for survival. Now again, if you want to become a little bit more of a glass cannon, then go ahead, you can bump crit damage here. You're going to get plenty of crit hit from kind of the skill tree and probably from gear. So you should be okay, to be honest with you. I'm critting like nobody's business. So on this build, so I'm not too worried, and I didn't put any extra points into crit. Now do note I have mythic ranks, that's why you'll see my stats are quite a bit higher. But for example, I have like plus 10 to dex, that's why my dex is 20 instead of 10. But as far as allocating actual points, again, attunement, intelligence, and constitution. If you want to go more glass cannon, you can go attunement, and then you could go strength. You could potentially go dex if you're struggling with your crit rating early on. You can get that instead of intelligence and constitution. That is up to you. But I wanted to make sure I'm tanky enough so I stay upright. And again, I ended up having no issue with any of the offensive stats personally. But those are my recommendations. Next, let's talk about the actual skill tree. Now, I actually started as a Brr-Zerker and then ended up going Clawbringer. But you could go either way technically. Clawbringer would be easier because you really want to go down this tree for this build. And then you're going to put some select points into Brr-Zerker. Now, our main skill here is going to be Storm Dragon's Judgment. I do want to point something out here. This has two elements to it. when you throw this hammer and it hits, it scales off lightning, melee damage, and then also melee damage. So lightning damage and melee damage are going to be big. Now, once it lands, it sticks to wherever it lands and pulses an AoE. That AoE pulses as ability damage, so it scales with lightning and ability damage. The way we play this build is we don't stick it there for very long. We slam it into the area and then we hit Q again to recover, or the action, your whatever your key is for your action ability, and it comes right back. It hits everything on the way back, just like how Thor throws his hammer and controls it to come back to you. So we mainly care about lightning melee damage here. That's how we're going to use this here. But do note, this is one of those abilities where you could technically scale both stats. Now, to support this playstyle, we're going to go ahead and start by putting 5 points to Oath of Thunder. So this is going to give us 40% bonus lightning damage to our melee attack and also to our Worm Companion. Now notice this is bonus lightning damage. Anytime you see the word bonus, it means that it just a flat increase. So let's say you do 100 damage, the baseline, this would give you an extra 40 lightning damage on top of it. As opposed to something like here, you're going to notice the Dragon Aura says it gives an increased elemental damage. That means you need some elemental damage present. So if your damage was 100 melee damage, like physical damage, you had no elemental damage, this wouldn't add anything. So let's say you did 100 elemental damage to make it easy. This would give you an extra 16 elemental damage in that case. So that's the difference between that wording. Very important thing to note as we look at this build. So we start with those 5 points. Note I do have here 8 points out of 5. That's because of gear. But that's where we want to start. Now, after that, I like getting 5 points into Rebuke because this is going to give us 15% damage reduction. And also, it makes it so that anytime you take damage, so it's you or your allies, even though it says all allies, it doesn't say you and allies, similar to how the Dragon Aura does. This is, I don't know if it's a typo or mislabeled, but it works for you too. And basically, anything that hits you, melee or range, they take 20% lightning damage. But mainly, I like it for the survival here. Now, you could alternatively first pump Dedication if you want. This is going to increase your action skill cooldown rate. The only downside to this is that if your shielding gets knocked down and you don't have ways of pumping up your shielding early game, this is not always going to be 25%, which is a little frustrating. But don't worry, when you use your Storm Dragon's Judgment, when you recall it right away, you're going to actually lower your cooldown rate quite significantly. So you're never going to have a 21-second cooldown. You're also not going to have it out there for 8 seconds. So you're going to throw it out, bring it back, and your baseline cooldown is probably going to be between 10 and 15 seconds or so. And then it's going to be lower than that based on your action cooldown reduction. So again, I believe I went with Rebuke and then I pumped Dedication. That'll give us 15 points. Now, I went and I put 1 point into Oath of Fire. This is important because it's going to give us 4% bonus fire damage. This just lets you apply a second element. And what's going to be important here is for later on, there's going to be a synergy where we need fire damage. But this is why I only put 1 point. Okay. So at that point, we are at 15 points right here. And that lets us go into the next tier. So we put 1 point into Storm Breath. I like this because for 1 point, it's going to give you an extra 12% damage reduction. So we're getting 12 plus 15 here. That's 27% mitigation. And now your worm's going to do it's going to do a decent amount of damage. Again, our pet isn't our main source of damage here, but it's okay. We're mainly getting it for the mitigation. Okay. Now that puts us at 16 points, and then we have 4 more points before we unlock the next tier. So what we're going to want to go ahead and do is going to be put 4 more points into here, into Dragon Aura. That's going to give us that 60% elemental damage to us and basically our entire party. And then what I like to put is we're going to go ahead and put 3 points into Awe. This is amazing. So notice what it says. After dealing fire damage, you increase your crit hit damage for a short period, which is 12 seconds. And then if you do lightning damage, you're going to increase your critical hit chance. So this is important. We want to be doing lightning and fire damage as often as possible to make sure that we maintain this critical hit damage and chance. Now, I do have 5 out of 3 here. because of gear, which is nice if you can get that. But either way, you're going to have a nice buff to both of these elements, and it's going to be up pretty much all the time. Now, if you have a lightning attack, and one of the weapons you'll see it that I like using has a base lightning attack, that's going to do the lightning attack plus the 4% bonus fire. So shooting something with that gun is going to automatically proc this. So that's one way of proccing it. Or you can, of course, through your hammer that does lightning damage, and after that it's going to do more lightning damage. Or you could also have a lightning spell potentially. Okay, so this is that element. And then at that point, you need to put at least one more point in somewhere. Now, I chose to put my first point into Radiance here because I eventually am going to put 5 out of 5 Radiance. I want lots of max ward, and you're going to see why when we look at the gear. It's basically just going to make it so we can be extremely tanky and we can regen the most amount of potential shielding here. You could, of course, max out the Dragon Aura here and or put damage on the Oath of Fire, but the thing is, we're not really going to be doing that much damage with our guns, so I'm not really leaning into buffing our guns here. And then we are going to put 1 point into Storm Smite. Now this actually ends up doing a good amount of damage, and it hits like the whole screen. The only downside on this is I don't like the 25-second cooldown. I don't feel like this is overpowered to where it needs to have a 25-second cooldown. There are definitely synergies and abilities and guns that are so broken that do so much more. I feel like the developers should maybe get rid of this cooldown or lower it to maybe 5 or 10 seconds. And then I think it would feel even better. We're mainly picking it up because we definitely want awe. There's no reason not to get this 1 point once we're this far dedicated. Now at that point, you can go ahead and jump over to Brr-Zerker. I'm not going to finish up Radiance till the very, very end. So Radiance, the other 4 points happen at the end here because I want to get Savagery in there. And so for 5 points, you get 20% melee damage. And also you're going to get your in range plus 5 seconds. Now I want to point out what's kind of cool is your Brr-Zerker passive is going to add bonus ice damage to your attacks. This is very, very important because again, I said bonus. That means you do not have to have a baseline ice element to your weapon to get ice damage. So whenever you rage, and you rage anytime you activate your main ability here, your attack, no matter what it is, if it's a melee attack, melee base, like your Storm Dragon's Judgment, you're going to do whatever your base damage is, which in this case is lightning. You're also going to go ahead and do that ice damage. And then again, whatever your gun is going to have its effect plus fire. So you're going to be doing fire, ice, and lightning damage consistently, which is really, really nice here. Now, next, you're going to go ahead and put 5 points into the old way. This increases your damage and mitigation. Now, the one downside to this in a way is when you're at medium or long range, you're not going to get that much of it. But inevitably, enemies will get closer. You're going to be in a close range, and you're going to get that extra survivability and get that extra damage. I considered just pumping frost damage, but again, especially if you're playing solo, you're going to have enemies that come up onto you. So this is you're going to be you will get this benefit sometimes, just not all the time. And then after these 10 points, you're going to have 3 points to put into Cold Snap. This is going to increase your movement. Again, it's going to double this. You're going to be almost always enraged. So you're going to get 18% movement speed and 48% frost efficiency. This is big. We want to be able to freeze enemies. For those of you that don't know, when an enemy is frozen, it takes 300% extra damage from melee attacks. This not only is your melee attack, but it also counts as Storm Dragon's Judgment, as it is an attack that does melee damage, even though it's at ranged. So if you can freeze things at range, this can be a really good synergy. And then after that, as I mentioned earlier, you go back and you finish up Radiance here for you, those points. Again, you could put it in other places. I consider put it into Icebreaker, where you can do it up to extra 30% damage. That is up to you. Again, I found that I was trying to be survivable. I didn't really have issues with DPS, but if you're struggling, if you don't have great gear yet, and you can kind of finesse things, you can instead dump those points here in either Ancestral Frost if you want just the reliable frost damage, or you can go ahead and do Icebreaker. I'd probably say Icebreaker. because again, this will also scale even when enemies aren't quite frozen, but you're just getting cold and semi-frozen, and that's going to happen quite a bit. So those are the skills. Right, now let's talk about gear. I'm going to start with the rings. So I don't have optimized rings, but you want melee damage rings. What I really like is basically, since you're going to be very ward focused and you're going to be, you're going to be getting hit, I kind of like this while ward is not full, effects are increased by 100%. You're going to be bouncing between some form of damage more often than not. So this is pretty reliable. Also, the one whenever you hit bosses or elites, increasing is kind of nice. But as far as your modifiers here is, you definitely want action skill cooldown rate. That is a gimme. If it doesn't have that, I don't like putting it on here because we want to get that action skill cooldown rate as low as possible. And then for the other one, in a perfect world, you would, for example, have melee crit damage or melee crit chance. Melee crit damage, I would say, is probably the one I want the most for my playthrough right now. So notice I have companion crit hit that chance, which is okay. And then on this one, also while in the dungeon, effects are increased 25%. You're gonna when you're running chaos dungeons, which is the only place where any of this matters as far as difficulty, in my opinion, this is gonna be active. So an extra 25%, that's pretty good. Again, I have action skill cooldown rate, which is great. It's chaotic. The action skill duration isn't useful at all to us because again, we're never gonna keep it up for the full duration. So those are the rings. Now, we are making a very specific commitment when it comes to the armor. We chose this kind of armor, legend armor here, and what we care about is this resolves all but 1 hit point, returning 150%. Ward capacity and ward regeneration delay is reduced by minus 50%. We mainly care about this because we want to get our ward as high as possible within reason, factoring the shield that we want to use. And this is going to combo with our necklace here. So in the necklace, I just want to point out this special ability. Activating an action skill instantly restores 50% of your ward over 2 seconds. So with my gear right now, which isn't optimized yet, but it's pretty good, I have over 22,000 ward, which is shielding. So every time I cast my hammer, I heal 11,000 shielding or ward over 2 seconds. That is absolutely insane. So you can spam your ability in this playstyle every 5 or 6 seconds the way I have it set up right now. So this is really, really good for survival.
Ah, yes. The build.
So, well, there you go. See, even my character is breaking the fourth wall and commenting on the build. Now, as far as the stats here, I really, really like the plus skill bonuses. As you saw my skill tree, the bonuses to frost damage to melee, and also that big boost to my crit hit damage and crit hit chance. Really like that. Now, melee damage on here is amazing. Melee crit chance is amazing. The fire rate, I could do without. But outside of that, this is about as good as I would want as far as type of stats. If I could have melee crit hit damage on here instead of fire rate, or maybe action skill cooldown reduction, that would be even better. Looking at that neck piece, as I mentioned, Clawbringer power and frost damage is phenomenal. Brr-Zerker would have been fine as well, or if you could get a combination of Clawbringer and Brr-Zerker, that'd be all the best. But can't go wrong with frost damage because that is going to be your highest elemental damage that you do. The 26.6% shield capacity is great. The gun handling is a total waste. So again, it's not optimized, but this is decent. And the fact that it's volatile, that's the big plus for me here. Now your shield. This shield doesn't have the greatest capacity. And so I was torn about this a little bit, but in the long term, because I have 22,000 shielding still, this was worth it. And the reason this was worth it is because you're going to notice here two things. One, this version does have max health, which is nice because, again, that health is going to convert to more shielding based on the conversion of the armor here. But really the key here is the 75% or plus 75% chance to reflect bullets and arrows at attackers and nearby enemies while ward is not depleted. And that not depleted is just basically any amount higher than 0. So this is a big, big deal. Dealing with projectiles, you are 3/4 of all projectiles get reflected back. So not only do you not take damage, but it's going to hit those enemies back. So you're going to have reflection of these. And also don't forget, in the skill tree, we had all damage reflects 20% of that damage back at them. So you can have multiple ways of reflecting damage at enemies. So this is really cool. And as far as the enchantment, I have on action skill start, increase melee damage by 40% for 10 seconds. This is great because, again, you're going to start that ability, you're going to throw the hammer, it's going to be active, the hammer is going to land and hit moments later, and it's going to be modified by this 40%, which is great. I do want to point out, as of the making this video, there are basically enchants that say while action skill is active. Those are much more powerful, and right now they're bugged. So our ability, we are not going to keep our action skill up the whole 8 seconds. We're only going to have it up for a short period. So in the future, that's not going to be so powerful. But right now, again, those enchants are bugged, and they last the full 60 seconds instead of the 1 second or so. So in the meantime, you could get one of those really powerful while action skill is active abilities. Feel free to take advantage of them. You're going to enjoy them for 60 seconds. Just note, as soon as it gets nerfed, it's going to feel way worse with this build because your action skill uptime is only going to be a couple of seconds here. So that's the recommendation here. Basically, anything that's going to buff your melee damage or damage in general, general damage is good. You want to stay away from gun damage, for example, or spell damage. Spell damage would really be a really distant, like, third option. And that brings us to our spell. Now, I went thematic. I went with the Snowballing Storming Ice Spike. So this is a modifier of the Ice Spike that makes it that it creates a storm in the area. So it's an AoE. And it also has 3 charges. And I'll show you what this looks like. So it sacrifices base damage and spell crit chance, but instead it has a huge plus 120% spell status effect chance. So it's more likely to actually cause the frost, and 406% spell status effect damage. So this actually, when it ticks, it does almost as much. It basically does 40% of a damage per tick as the base damage. So the base damage is 716. The dot damage is 302. Again, it's over 4 times higher than the baseline. And obviously this slows and it acts towards freezing enemies. So this is how it looks. I really like the look. It's very thematic. So here's the storm. And again, you can get this 3 times, which is really nice. Now, as far as weapons go, there's really 2 weapons that I mainly use. So I like freezing things or help freeze them. And so the liquid cooling legendary here is quite good for that. If you can get a ×2 like this, it's even better. The enchantment I used on this is while action skill is active, increase lightning damage by 50%. Now, basically, remember, this is going to work for 60 seconds right now. The main reason I have this is when we throw our hammer, it's going to be active. As long as it's in the ground and pulsing, it's active. And then when we call it back, it ends. But at that point, that's when most of our lightning damage ends as well. So it's going to be active when it counts. So having this lightning damage is good. Even though we're using a cold gun, this works well. Now, alternatively, you could put, if you're lucky, and get the 50% to cold damage if you're going to be shooting. But that is only useful if you keep the hammer in the ground and don't bring it back. So if you call it out, leave it there, and shoot while it's up. That's why I put lightning on it. So that's the first weapon. And then the second weapon is the live wire weapon. And so this creates a kind of a chaining effect. And so what it basically does when you have this weapon and you target something, it's going to kind of mark it after a couple of shots. And then if you shoot another enemy, it's going to do kind of like a chain lightning. Now, as it's been well documented, if you do melee attacks, this also helps with that chain. Now, it's not... I can't fully tell if it's quite as effective with these ranged melee attacks. But again, my main reason for having this gun is to use it appropriately, but mainly I just tag things in the burst mode. Actually, right now it's in full auto. I like to burst mode to just tap something and to proc that fire damage and lightning damage to get both the crit chance and crit damage active. at the beginning, and that's going to last 12 seconds. Then I call out a storm, and then I'm going to go ahead and throw my hammer. It's going to do that big effect, then I'm going to call it back, and then I'm going to go with my melee attacks. And this allows me to stay at that kind of mid-range, nice and safe. And notice already my hammer's already back as I bring it back. So you can, look at that, that's 5-second cooldown for me. So I can just go around, tag things, I can use my storm, I can use my hammer, bring it back, swing my sword a couple of times, pre-tag some enemies, okay, storm again, hammer again, bring it back again. That is kind of your playstyle right there. All right, now let's talk about the melee weapon that will support this. And so the weapon is the Ragnarok weapon, and there's the variant here. Mine is a Courageous Assassin, right? Prefix and suffix. So the main thing we care about here is this will always come with Ragnarok. Melee attacks fire a ranged projectile that deals melee damage and attaches a sticky bomb that explodes after a duration. So this is important. This will be a ranged attack that scales with melee damage. It's a little weird because what you're going to notice is going to hit things. They're going to take a little bit of damage, but it may not even look like they get any damage. And then a second later, if you spam it a couple times, you'll see it take a burst damage. And that's because it's the explosion of the sticky bombs. It looks a little weird, but the animation is pretty cool. And then the secondary effect is this one has Echo. Melee attacks deal 10% of all non-melee damage dealt by the Fate Maker over the last 10 seconds as a bonus damage and resets afterwards. So this basically, imagine before you swung with this weapon, you went and you did this, and this hit a couple enemies and it started stacking some damage, and then you shot with your weapon, right? You shot with this for a second for whatever reason. Then you did your hammer toss and called it back and then started swinging. This would have taken, it would not have taken the hammer damage that you tossed, right? Because that's melee. But any of the pulsing damage it did, and let me show you, the pulsing is that AoE right now that's going on. It's obviously not hitting anything, but if it hit anything there, it would take that damage. You would have taken the gun damage. It would have also, any damage done by the storm, taken all of that, taken 10% of that, and for every swing, it would have 10%, basically that damage, 10% of that total damage for the swings. And it keeps recalculating every 10 seconds. That's a way to help boost your damage for your swing. Now, alternatively, there's other versions. So this one's good as well. This is, let's take a look. It's called the Umbro Ragnarok. So it has vampire on it. And so melee attacks restore 10% of your max health and max ward. Now, we don't care about the max health because we're going to have 1 health. But remember, I have 22,000 ward. So every time you swing and hit things, this is going to go ahead and give me 2,200 ward. That is huge. So if you're having trouble surviving, this is good. Now, enchant-wise, the one I actually like is Enchanted. Gain 30% melee damage against bosses and badasses. This is up at all times. The reality is anything that's not a badass or boss is going to probably get one shot by anything you do. So this 30% flatline is my favorite one. Other ones are pretty good too. So this one is not one. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to reroll a good enough mode on this. We don't do any dark magic damage, which is not very good. But you could get something that increases frost damage, that increases elemental damage, flat damage, anything that does electric damage that can passively help buff your other forms of damage would be fine as well. The other weapon that's really cool is the Fate Breaker. Now, the Fate Breaker does more base damage, and it has an effect called Fate Breaker. Melee attacks create 3 lightning projectiles that restore ward equal to 100% of damage dealt. Let me show you how that looks like when you equip it. The attack actually looks really cool. It sends out these birds. The one problem is they spread out a little bit, and it's actually hard to hit things with all 3 of them. If you were to get close enough, you could, but you end up doing this lunge attack when you're close, and it won't proc that bird all the time. So I found this in some situations when there was a lot of enemies around. This kind of creates kind of an AoE effect, and it does really well, but other times not as much. Now, there's different versions of it. So there is the Echo version that, again, will increase its damage based on your non-melee damage prior. And here's one that has Vampiric. So again, that's the one that allows you to double down on the ward regeneration. So in theory, being able to regenerate based off Fatebreaker and Vampire kind of can give you the best of both worlds if you're really struggling with survival. So I have that on here as well. As you'll notice, they do come in different elements. Here's 2 ice ones, here's a fire one. So depending on what you're stacking. So if I had lightning on this would probably be even better. And because I have the 50% lightning boost. So that's important. Now, I do want to point out of a gear, when it comes to enchants, you cannot have 2 of the exact same enchants. So you'll notice across my gear, they have to be different. So here's an on spell cast, you have an abilities. Here is on skill action start, melee damage. But for example, if your spell had on action skill start increased damage by 20%, and if your shield had the same exact thing, it said damage dealt instead of melee damage dealt, this would not stack. So they have to have different wording. So that's very, very important. Now, final mini recommendation if you're soloing, when you go through your chaos runs, you will inevitably, when you're trying to unlock chaos level 20, you are going to be fighting the final boss of the game. And there is a phase where a support dragon comes out and floats around, and for whatever reason, the ranged melee attacks, for me, don't hit it. I was really struggling to do damage to that dragon. So what I found is getting a gun like this, and there's a typo here, but this gun right here summons Hydras when I reload. And there's a bunch of different ones that do this. All that really matters is that you're able to get some Hydras. You could also technically, I believe, get the fairies. They'll do a great job as well. And you can kind of throw them at the feet of the dragon, and they'll auto-target and actually do damage to the dragon and wear it down. So if there are certain buggy areas in the game where your melee attacks, for example, aren't reaching, and against flying enemies, sometimes this hammer, because it has nothing to land on, will kind of bug out, not do the damage. In those cases, having kind of a backup weapon like this that you only use when you need to kind of kill a flying enemy that is bugged like that, that's good to have in the wings. But otherwise, you're going to never use this. You're going to use either your lightning gun or your ice gun, preferably. All right, guys. So what do you think of my Thor Stormcaller build? Do let me know in the comments below. If you did like this video, again, do drop a like. It helps the video tremendously. Subscribe if you want to see more looter shooter comment just like this. And if you want to play along with me, get some free Chaos 20 carries, make sure to check me out on Twitch. That is at twitch.tv/LeeroyGamingStream. Also, join my Discord where I communicate with my community on a regular basis. This is also a great place to find out when I'm going to have my next stream, as well as Twitter. All the information you need to joining those social media access points can be found in the description below. And as always, guys, thank you for all the support, and I will see you in my next video.